This was a busy week for us, and so we bring you a shorter episode than normal. We have not done this one before due to the lack of detailed information about the wreck, but since we already had done research on it, it was convenient to do, as we did not have time to do a longer episode. We would also like to apologize for the sound quality in this episode. We will do our best to make it up to you all next week. One of the survivors of the Wilhelmsburg wreck wrote a narrative account for the Examiner on December 26, 1863. Quote, "Of the Wilhelmsburg, one of the largest vessels sailing from Hamburg, nothing remains but a portion of the after part, which, in consequence of the strength of the deck, still remains a little above water. I will briefly tell you our adventures from the time we sailed."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Storm of the Wilhelmsburg.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Wilhelmsburg was a 1,200-ton wooden-hulled barque, owned by the Hamburg-based Godfrey & Son, one of the more prominent ship owners in Hamburg at the time. Built in 1853, the Wilhelmsburg was to be an important ship in transporting German immigrants to Australia for the entirety of her 10-year career. The Wilhelmsburg holds the record for the largest number of passengers to be transported in one voyage on a ship of her size, though that does not suggest the voyages that she offered were particularly comfortable. Still, for the duration of her career, she would be considered to be a valuable ship, and one of the finest to be based out of Hamburg, a reputation that undoubtedly helped her attract the large number of passengers that she carried on her voyages. On the 29th of November, the Wilhelmsburg departed from Hamburg bound for Queensland. On board she had 282 passengers, as well as what would later be estimated at a crew between 60 and 80, under the command of Captain Gross. By the next day, they were past Cuxhaven and were out to sea. Initially, the weather of the voyage seemed promising, but this proved to be deceptive. With each passing day, the westerly wind grew more and more, until it turned into a violent gale. The storms that covered the region would later make international news. On the 2nd and 3rd of December alone, the storms cost an estimated 150 lives along the Dutch and French coasts. All along the coasts and rivers, the storms did damage and multiple shipwrecks were reported. Unfortunately, it was into this storm system that the Wilhelmsburg was traveling. Although they missed the storms of the 2nd and 3rd, and only experienced the winds, the storms do not seem to have given up much of their strength by the time that the Wilhelmsburg reached the coast of Holland on the 4th of December. It does not seem to have been the intention of Captain Gross to get so close to the coast of Holland. The contrary winds grew to such a force that they were being blown towards the coast against all of his intentions. All of the sails that the Wilhelmsburg was carrying were split in the winds, and any that were not set were carried away by the same violent storm. Eventually, it got to the point where the sailors would no longer go up the masts. Everyone on the ship, the passengers included, believed that at any moment the ship would lose her masts entirely. At a certain point, as night fell, the Wilhelmsburg became completely at the mercy of the wind and waves, completely unmanageable and full of terrified passengers. At 1 in the morning on the 6th of December, Captain Gross ordered there to be a sounding made, and to the horror of those on board, they found that they were in only 17 feet of water. The winds of the storms had finally brought them against the coast. It was only a few minutes later the bow of the Wilhelmsburg struck, and after bouncing back, the stern of the Wilhelmsburg struck, destroying their rudder. With the second strike, there was an attempt made to cut down the ship masts, but they were too late. The masts came falling down onto the deck before they could be chopped down, smashing large holes in the deck. Water immediately came pouring into the holes in the deck, and those who were below deck, which was the majority of the passengers who were traveling in steerage, were trapped with no chance to escape. The next moment, the ship broke in two with a crash. To the horror of those who were on the stern half of the ship, the bow portion of the ship sank immediately, taking with it those who had been on the deck towards the front of the ship as well. It was estimated that in only a few minutes, 250 to 300 people were lost, with no chance to save themselves. Among those who were lost in those terrible moments was Captain Gross. It was later reported that he had been crushed when the mainmast had fallen. A survivor would later say that they had no time to help anyone, that they hardly had enough time to save themselves in those terrible moments, even though the wounded and those who were already gone began to float all around them, adding a grim reminder to their situation. The stern portion of the ship was also not able to remain afloat. It too settled to the bottom, but it was in shallow enough water that it was not completely submerged, giving the people who had been standing on the deck a chance to take shelter in the largest of the ship's boats. The waves were now crashing over the stern half of the ship, carrying away anything that was not secured to the ship, but the boat was trapped by the wreckage of the masts and some water barrels and was unmoving. Some of the survivors held themselves in it, clutching to it as the waves crashed around and over them. Other survivors clung to the wreckage of the masts themselves or to the water barrels. Miserable hours passed by as they waited until dawn, hungry, exhausted, and showing signs of the extreme cold that they were subjected to, with no chance of relief. Around 7 in the morning, they spotted another barque, who seemed in much better condition than their ship had been. Her masts were also gone, but in this case they had been clearly cut away. She had also been driven onto the sand, but she was holding together fine. As they watched, the crew of the other barque launched a longboat and safely reached land. Inspired by the other crew's success, the remaining crew of the Wilhelmsburg decided to try their luck in their own boat. With this news, the other survivors emerged from where they had been sheltering around the deck. In the end, it was discovered that there were 10 more survivors than the boat could hold, and since the crew gave priority to the passengers, 10 of the crew members remained behind on the ship, giving their places in the boat to passengers. As it was, the boat was in poor shape and leaking. Overloading it seemed like a dangerous prospect. The boat departed from the Wilhelmsburg with a promise to soon return for those on the wreck. But the boat got stuck before reaching the shore, and those on board of her had to wade the rest of the way. While the crew of the other barque had rowed ashore on a favorable tide, by the time that the people of the Wilhelmsburg had made the attempt, the tide was in ebb and the boat was stranded high and dry. With the realization that they would not receive any help from their fellows on shore, the remaining crew in the Wilhelmsburg began to look around for a way to help themselves. They eventually found a small boat that was damaged, but they were able to repair enough to hold them, and the remaining 10 men headed for shore. They did not have much by the way of oars, but, fortunately, the waves were in their favor, and they were carried to shore where they joined the others. They still did not have shelter or food as they huddled on the beach, but the lack of waves beating over them was considered a relief. In the evening of the next day, men found them and they were transported by cart to the nearest village. It was only once they were in the village that they found out that they were on the island of Terschelling. On taking stock of the survivors, it was found that out of almost 300 passengers, only 25 had survived, and out of the crew, there were only 15 survivors. All of them had lost everything. None of them had any clothing or personal possessions left, and they were entirely dependent on what they were given by those they met with. They were eventually brought to Harlingen, courtesy of Godfrey and Sons, and from there they were brought back to Hamburg, where they were met with great kindness. One or two of the passengers almost immediately departed from Hamburg, however, headed to England, where they hoped to find another vessel that would take them to Australia, undeterred by the tragedy that had befallen their first attempt. Godfrey and Sons did not only dispatch one of their captains and a crew to offer aid to the survivors. It was also hoped by the company that at least some of the ship or her cargo could be salvaged. The forward part of the vessel, which had sunk, broke up the day after the survivors departed from the beach, however, strewing the beach with hundreds of remains, as well as timber, general cargo, chests, bedding, provisions, and rigging for miles. It was later decided that the best way to dispose of the wreckage would be to auction it off on the spot. What remained of the once well-known and respected ship, including her cargo, went for a little less than 100 pounds sterling, speaking poignantly to her total destruction. For more information, please see the Mayboro Chronicle from March 14th, 1864, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.